Okay, so today in class we examined a lot of the New Deal programs under FDR. We're going to kind of go back and look at really specifically some things FDR did when we look at how he fought the Great Depression. So we'll look at some of his initial first steps. We'll describe some of the New Deal works programs, and then also identify some critics of FDR. So if you look at 1932 roughly, people are pretty fed up. They've been suffering, which we kind of already looked at. There's a lack of work, there's a lack of food, and there's an overall kind of lack of hope. And so when the election of 1932 runs around or comes around, you've got Herbert Hoover, the Republican, running for re-election versus FDR. FDR is a two-term governor from New York. And as governor of New York, he's proved to be pretty effective. He's reform-minded, and he had done a lot of work to combat the problems of unemployment and poverty. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt possessed kind of this can-do attitude, and he projected this air of friendliness and confidence that is going to be very attractive to voters. And that, coupled with Hoover kind of being seen to deal with the Depression ineffectively so far, allows Roosevelt to win an overwhelming victory. Roosevelt's a Democrat. You also have the Democrats taking control of both the House and the Senate, which is fairly significant. They had the greatest majority in the House that they'd had since the Civil War, since before the Civil War at this point. So, pretty significant takeover for the Democrats in the election of 1932. So, elections in November. Roosevelt's not going to come into office for 4 more months, till March roughly, when he would take over. He's not going to sit idly by. He begins to formulate his plan, which becomes known as the New Deal, which is just a set of policies designed to alleviate the problems of the Depression. So he begins to formulate this and present it to the public. His New Deal policies had 3 general goals. There is relief for the needy, there is economic recovery, and then there is financial reform. Those are kind of the 3 legs of his New Deal programs. And within what he calls the first 100 days, FDR is going to try to enact a lot of legislation aimed at accomplishing those 3 goals. So his first 100 days in office, Congress is going to pass more than 15 major pieces of New Deal legislation. These laws and the others that follow are going to significantly expand the role of the federal government in the nation's economy, and you're going to see the government aggressively try to accomplish those goals we just outlined. So Roosevelt's first kind of step in the first 100 days was to make reforms in banking and finance. And so the first thing he did is he declared a bank holiday. Now, a bank holiday is basically you just close the banks for a time period. In doing so, then if you close the banks, you couldn't have run on banks because they weren't open. And so he declares this bank holiday. He then persuades Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The Emergency Banking Relief Act was basically, excuse me, a measure that restored some of the public's confidence in the banks. In doing so, again, we're trying to restore confidence, trying to get people to keep their money in banks, and trying to make sure that those banks don't fail. The Emergency Banking Relief Act basically just allowed the Treasury Department to inspect the country's banks, and then If they determined that the bank was a good bank, they allowed it to reopen from the banking holiday. If it was one that was kind of in danger, it would remain closed. Those that needed help then could receive loans. And again, it allows some more confidence to be established into the banking system. Roosevelt also, during his first 100 days, establishes kind of this tradition. It's known as the fireside chat, where he delivers radio addresses to the nation. His first is delivered on March 12th of 1933. In this specific chat, he explains why the nation's welfare depended on public support of the government and the banking system. So he kind of tells people why it's a bad idea to try to go get all your money out of the bank and those types of things. And he discusses and explains the banking system to the public in general. In doing so, he explained why, when too many people demanded their savings in cash, banks would fail. And, that this isn't necessarily because banks were weak, but it's because even strong banks could not meet, those heavy demands. We have that fractional reserve system. And so over the next few weeks after this chat, people are going to return their money and their savings to the banks. And so you have some more confidence restored. Roosevelt gives numerous fireside chats throughout his presidency, and it's he's kind of a soothing figure in a lot of those. Roosevelt also passes some legislation that regulates banking and finance. We have the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, which established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC, we still have today. If you've seen a financial commercial, usually at the end there's something that says member FDIC. That goes back to this. We wanted to insure people's money in the bank so then they would leave it in the bank. And so say even if your bank fails, your savings up to a certain amount is guaranteed, which is very important for establishing that confidence. The Federal Securities Act of 1933 was also a fairly major piece of legislation. It required corporations to provide complete information on all their stock offerings, and it made them liable for any misrepresentations. And so today we have a Federal Securities Act, or Federal Securities Commission, that again makes sure companies are doing things the right way. In 1934, Congress created the Securities Exchange Commission, which was designed to regulate the stock market. And then also, not that this necessarily fits here, but it does if you think about it. Roosevelt also encouraged Congress to pass the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. Why would they do that? Well, the government wanted to profit on the sale and consumption of alcohol. Just like today, you have people that want to argue that marijuana should be legalized because then the government could make money off of it. Same thing here. Alcohol, people were consuming it anyway. Let's allow the government to make some money off of it was kind of the idea. But we have all kinds of reforms. So those reforms were designed at helping in regulating the finance industry. Roosevelt also is going to implement programs to provide relief to farmers who might have been perhaps the hardest hit by the Depression. So he's going to do that. He's also going to focus on ways to aid other workers in an attempt to stimulate the economy. So if we look at rural assistance, probably the biggest thing that came out of it, the biggest chunk of that alphabet soup, is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA. The Agricultural Adjustment Act looked at farm prices and said, well, what can we do to make those prices go up? And they had a sound understanding of economics. And so what they wanted to do to increase farm prices was to lower production. And to get farmers not to plant a field, they basically paid farmers not to plant. Now, as you can imagine, we mentioned things like bread lines and soup kitchens earlier. When we looked at the Great Depression, there's a lot of suffering going on. This is not necessarily a popular thing to do. Many Americans are going to be very upset by the fact that the government is paying people not to plant things when people are suffering and when people are starving. And so it's going to be controversial in that. We also have the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, which focused on the infrastructure in the Tennessee River Valley. It was aging, it was in poor shape. And so what the TVA did is they said, Roosevelt looked at it and said, well, we can kill kind of two birds with one stone here. We can improve our infrastructure and provide jobs. And so that's what the TVA did. It created thousands of jobs while at the same time providing flood control and hydroelectric power to the impoverished region of the TVA. So you still hear that today when we look at, if you're paying attention to the presidential campaigns today, you have candidates out there saying we need to improve our infrastructure, and then doing so will provide government jobs. So it's something that's carried over from that. Excuse me. We also wanted to find ways to provide people jobs. And so we've got the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which was more focused on young men. It put young men ages 18 to 25 to work building roads, developing parks, planting trees, helping with soil erosion, flood control, those types of projects. Many of these men are going to end up working on the Great Plains, where a lot of their efforts are going to be aimed at preventing another Dust Bowl, which is something we've already kind of covered. But, they want to prevent that. Another kind of works type project was provided under the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA. And you've got a couple of things under that. We've got the Public Works Administration, or the PWA, which provided basically money to states to create jobs in construction of schools and other community buildings. We're going to have many buildings built that way. We've also got the Civil Works Administration, where the CWA was kind of a solution to the PWA when the PWA failed to really make a dent in unemployment. Because the PWA more just provided money. The Civil Works Administration actually provided 4 million immediate jobs, and ultimately they built 40,000 schools and paid the salaries of 50,000 school teachers in rural areas. So pretty significant in that respect. Excuse me. So we've got that. We're trying to provide jobs. But the NIRA also sought to promote industrial growth and ultimately long-term stability by establishing codes of fair practices for individual industries. So also created under the NIRA, we've got the NRA, and that's not the National Rifle Association, it's the National Recovery Administration. The National Recovery Administration set prices for product, established standards, but again, its main aim is to promote recovery by looking at the relationship between management and workers and trying to address issues. And so the NRA really wanted to eliminate the trend of wage cuts, falling prices, and then layoffs. So they guaranteed workers the rights to unionize and to collectively bargain, and to try to, again, make long-term stability that way. We've also have programs under the New Deal that were aimed at helping the American people directly with food, clothing, and shelter. We've got the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, which provided government loans to homeowners who faced foreclosure because they could not make their loan payments. You also have the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, which was created in 1934, which this organization is still around today. They were, or its goal was to furnish loans for home mortgages and repairs. And then we've got the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or the FERA, and this is under this program, you direct relief is provided to the needy. So we have those things. So a lot of these programs are successful, or at least people are getting back to work. Conditions are improving somewhat, but not everyone was happy with what Roosevelt was doing. And a lot of his programs and his presidency in general is going to come under attack. And if you haven't guessed it already, to do all the things Roosevelt was doing during the Great Depression, it cost a lot of money. And it cost a lot of money that the government did not have. And so what they began to do was they were spending more money than the government was taking in. That's called deficit spending. Now, if you do deficit spending long enough, you run up a national debt. So that's what was happening during this period. Roosevelt is going to counter his critics and say, yes, deficit spending is bad, but in this case, it's a necessary evil to accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish. So many people are going to attack him for that deficit spending. But he's also going to face criticism within his own party. There are going to be some liberals who think that his New Deal programs didn't go far enough to help the poor, to help the needy. There's going to be conservatives and Republicans that are going to argue that Roosevelt spent too much on direct relief and used the New Deal policies to control business and socialize the economy, which they're going to be very much against. So he's coming under attack from different angles. He also is coming under attack indirectly from the Supreme Court. There are two court cases that make it to the Supreme Court. And they are, the Supreme Court in the 1930s is a rather conservative looking court. It's made up of more conservative judges, and they strike down two New Deal programs. In 1935, the court struck down the NIRA. They said the NIRA, it's unconstitutional. And then in 1936, the court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So Roosevelt is getting some legal challenge to his New Deal programs. Well, he sees an opportunity, and he tries to pack the Supreme Court with liberal judges. Well, he almost kind of does it. In 1937, Roosevelt tries to get Congress, which is mainly Democrats, to pass the court packing bill. This is a wildly unpopular bill, and what it would have allowed him to do is to basically pack the court with his type of judges, or liberal judges, but ultimately that's going to be struck down. It's not until 1937, or later 1937, when you're going to have some death of some members of the Supreme Court, some retirements, that Roosevelt's going to be able to appoint 7 new justices to the Supreme Court, which is a lot for a presidency. He's able to appoint 7 of the 9, and the courts are going to kind of flip and start supporting a lot of his New Deal programs. But again, he does have his critics. There's 3 kind of big ones that we'll look at, or your book mentions. First, we've got the American Liberty League, which opposed a lot of the New Deal measures that it believed violated the respect for the rights of individuals and property. They're saying, hey, a lot of these New Deal programs kind of step on those things. But we've got some individuals as well. We've got Charles Coughlin, who's a Roman Catholic priest. He's got a radio broadcast that where he kind of combines religious, economic, and political ideas. Um, Charles Coughlin favors a guaranteed income and the nationalization of banks. And his message resonates. He attracts a huge following. However, ultimately, he kind of undercuts his own support because he's very anti Semitic, and so he loses support. We've got another critic, and Dr. Francis Townsend. He's a physician, he's a health officer in Long Beach, California. Um, Townsend believed that Roosevelt wasn't doing enough to help the poor and elderly, so he focused on devising a pension plan that would provide monthly benefits to the aged. Um, the plan found a lot of strong support among the elderly. I mean, why not? Um, but again, he's not a serious challenge. Probably the biggest and most famous critic is Huey Long. Huey Long is or is a senator from Louisiana. Long is an early supporter of the New Deal, but he too is going to turn against Roosevelt because, again, he does not think that um, Roosevelt's gone far enough, and Huey Long has his own eyes on the presidency. He proposed a social program called Share Our Wealth. Um, it's very popular, and it's very popular. Um, However, at the height of Long's popularity, he's assassinated by a lone gunman. Um, which again, who knows what would have happened had he not been assassinated, but he is. And so we've got some critics, and as the first 100 days in Roosevelt's presidency come to an end, um, there's been some improvements, but Roosevelt knows much more is going to need to be done to help the people and to solve the nation's economic problems, which we'll continue to look at.